Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. It is the spring of 399 BC, and a young aristocrat named Plato, watching the wisest man in Athens condemned to death by a democratic jury for the crime of asking questions. That moment shattered Plato's world and gave birth to the question that would consume the next 50 years of his life. What is justice? The courtroom is packed with the heat and noise of 500 Athenian citizens pressed together on wooden benches. Socrates is 70 years old. He's on trial for his life. The charges are impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. The accusers, Malitus, Anytus, and Leon, have painted Socrates as a dangerous subversive, an atheist who teaches young men to disrespect their fathers and mock the gods. The evidence is thin, built mostly on fear and resentment, but the mood in the room is ugly. Athens has just lost a catastrophic war. The democracy has been briefly overthrown by tyrants. The city is wounded, paranoid, hungry for someone to blame. Socrates could save himself. A traditional Athenian defense involved weeping, begging, bringing one's children forward to plead for mercy. The juries were notoriously susceptible to emotional appeals, but Socrates does none of this. Instead, he does what he has always done. He asks questions. He speaks calmly, rationally, even playfully. He suggests that far from deserving death, he deserves to be fed at public expense in the Prytaneum, the highest honour Athens can bestow. After all, he argues, he has spent his entire life trying to improve his fellow citizens, waking them from their sleepwalking certainty. He has been Athens' gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of the state into awareness. The jury is not amused. Plato watches the hands go up. Guilty. 280 votes to 220. A narrow verdict, but final. Now, the penalty phase. Socrates, given one last chance to propose an alternative to death, offers to pay a small fine. The contempt is clear. The second vote is wider. Death by hemlock. 360 votes this time. More jurors vote for execution after hearing Socrates' defiance than voted for guilt. Socrates accepts the verdict with the same unsettling serenity. He tells the jury that no evil can come to a good man either in life or after death. He says that the unexamined life is not worth living, and then calmly he is led away. Plato sits frozen. The wisest man in Athens, perhaps the wisest man in the world, has just been condemned to death by the democratic city he loves. For what? For asking questions, for making people think, for refusing to accept easy answers. The injustice of it splits something open in Plato's mind. A question forms there that will haunt him for the next 50 years, that will drive him to travel the Mediterranean to establish a school, to write dialogues that will shape human thought for millennia. What is justice? If Athens can kill Socrates and call it lawful, what does justice even mean? Before we begin this journey through one man's search for truth, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple and wonderful way to support our work, and it means a great deal to me. I'm always curious where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away as we travel to ancient Athens, to the life of a philosopher who tried to answer the hardest questions human beings can ask. To understand why this death mattered so profoundly, we must go back to Plato's beginning to the world into which he was born, and the forces that shaped him long before he ever met the man who would change everything. He was born Aristocles sometime in 428 or 427 BC in the city that ruled the Greek world, Athens. The name Plato came later, a nickname whose origin remains uncertain. Some said it referred to his broad shoulders earned through wrestling training. Others claimed it meant his broad forehead, a sign of intelligence. Whatever the source, the name stuck and Aristocles disappeared into history, replaced by Plato. His family was everything in Athens. On his father's side, Ariston claimed direct descent from Codrus, the last king of Athens, a lineage that stretched back into the mists of legend. On his mother's side, Pricion traced her ancestry to Solon, the great lawgiver who had reformed Athenian society 2 centuries earlier and planted the seeds of democracy. This was not merely aristocracy. This was the aristocracy, the families who had shaped Athens when it was still young. Wealth came with the bloodline, land, slaves, education, influence. Plato grew up in a household where political power was assumed, where the question was not whether one would serve the city, but how his childhood unfolded in the shadow of the Parthenon, that magnificent temple to Athena gleaming white on the Acropolis, a monument to Athenian supremacy. But the man who had built it, Pericles, the towering statesman who had led Athens to its greatest heights, was already dead by the time Plato could form memories. The world Plato inherited was not the confident, expanding empire of his grandfather's generation. It was a world at war. The Peloponnesian War had begun in 431 BC, 3 years before Plato's birth, and it would grind on until he was a young man. Athens against Sparta, democracy against oligarchy, sea power against land power, a brutal struggle for dominance that would consume the Greek world for a generation. The war shaped everything. Plato's earliest memories would have been coloured by it. The constant funerals as the dead were brought back from distant campaigns, the public funeral orations in the Syracuse, the great cemetery where Athens honoured its fallen. The fear each summer when the Spartan army marched into Attica and burned the farms, driving the rural population behind Athens' long walls. But war or not, Plato received the education befitting his class. He was trained in gymnastics, his body hardened through wrestling and running. He studied music, learning the lyre and the mathematical ratios that governed harmony. He memorized Homer, the foundation of all Greek culture, and likely performed sections of the Iliad and Odyssey by heart. And he was introduced to mathematics, particularly geometry, which the Greeks believed revealed eternal truths beneath the chaos of the physical world. It was an education designed to produce a political leader, a man who could speak persuasively in the assembly, lead troops in battle, and govern wisely in peace. Everything in Plato's background pointed toward a traditional life of aristocratic public service. His family expected it. Athens expected it. He was being prepared to take his place among the city's rulers, to join the ranks of men who stood in the assembly and debated the fate of empires. But the Athens of Plato's youth was not the confident empire of his grandfather's time. It was a city tearing itself apart, and the young aristocrat was about to witness democracy reveal its darkest possibilities. By the time Plato reached adolescence, the war had been grinding on for more than 15 years. Athens was exhausted. The brilliant strategy of Pericles to avoid land battle with Sparta's superior army and strike from the sea had collapsed when plagues swept through the overcrowded city in 430 BC. The disease killed perhaps a quarter of the population, including Pericles himself. Thucydides, the great historian who survived it, described bodies piled in the streets, social order dissolving into panic and despair. Into the vacuum stepped men like Alcibiades, brilliant and utterly without scruple. Handsome, wealthy, charismatic, Alcibiades embodied everything dangerous about Athenian democracy. He could sway the assembly with his oratory, convince the people to pursue glory and conquest, and then, when his plans failed, defect to Sparta and help Athens' enemies. He was Athens personified, brilliant and self-destructive, capable of greatness and catastrophic error in equal measure. The worst of those errors came when Plato was about 13 years old. In 415 BC, Athens launched the Sicilian expedition, an attempt to conquer Syracuse, the powerful Greek city on the island of Sicily. It was madness disguised as ambition. The assembly, whipped into enthusiasm by demagogues promising easy victory and endless wealth, voted to send the largest fleet Athens had ever assembled. 200 ships, thousands of hoplites and sailors, the flower of Athenian manhood. It ended in absolute catastrophe. The expedition was destroyed utterly in 413 BC. The entire fleet was lost. Thousands of Athenian soldiers were killed in battle or died as slaves in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where they were worked to death under the Sicilian sun. Athens never truly recovered. The city that had ruled the Aegean was suddenly vulnerable, its treasury depleted, its military shattered. And throughout all of this, young Plato watched democracy in action. He saw the assembly, that great expression of the people's will, swing wildly from confidence to panic, from one policy to its opposite. Within weeks he watched demagogue, skilled speakers who told the crowd what it wanted to hear, manipulate the citizens into disastrous decisions. He observed how the demos, the people, could be swayed by rhetoric rather than reason, by appeals to emotion rather than careful thought. The same assembly that voted for the Sicilian expedition with wild enthusiasm later executed or exiled the generals who had tried to salvage the disaster. This was not theoretical for Plato. His relatives were deeply involved in the political struggles. Some, like his mother's cousin Cytus, were becoming convinced that democracy was the problem, that Athens needed the steady hand of the best men, the aristocrats, to rule without the interference of the ignorant mob. The war was revealing something ugly. Democracy, the system Athens claimed made it superior to Sparta's rigid oligarchy, was proving chaotic, violent, and self-destructive. It could be manipulated, it could make terrible decisions, it could turn on its own people. The seeds of Plato's later distrust of democracy were planted in these years, watching his city lurch from one crisis to another, watching the crowd cheer for policies that would destroy them. Amidst this chaos, a strange figure walked the agora, asking questions that made powerful men look foolish, and young Plato was about to meet him. Socrates was impossible to miss and easy to mock. He was short, barrel-chested, with a snub nose, bulging eyes, and thick lips. He went barefoot even in winter. He wore the same rough cloak year-round. He was poor, married to Xanthippe, a woman famous in Athens for her sharp tongue, and he had no regular employment. By all conventional measures he was a failure, and yet the young men of Athens flocked to him. Plato was about 20 years old when he fell into Socrates' orbit sometime around 408 BC. What drew him and dozens of other aristocratic youths was not Socrates' appearance or wealth or status. It was his method. Socrates had developed a way of questioning that was unlike anything else in Athens, a relentless systematic interrogation that exposed the emptiness beneath people's confident assertions. Imagine a scene in the agora, the marketplace that was the heart of Athenian public life. A prominent general, Laces, is holding forth on courage. He has fought in many battles. He knows courage when he sees it. Socrates approaches, polite, curious. What is courage exactly? The general is happy to explain. Courage is standing firm in battle, not fleeing. But what about tactical retreats? Socrates asks. The Spartans at Thermopylae retreated to draw the Persians in. Was that cowardice? No, of course not. So courage is not simply standing firm. Well, courage is endurance of the soul. But foolish endurance, rushing into battle without thought, that is not courage, is it? And wise endurance in pursuit of shameful ends, that cannot be courage either. So is courage wise endurance in pursuit of good? By this point, Laches is tied in knots. What seemed obvious moments ago is now confused. Socrates has not provided an answer. He has simply demonstrated that Laches, despite a lifetime of experience, cannot actually define what courage is. The method had a name Elenu's reputation, and it was devastating. This was dangerous, and it was thrilling. Dangerous because it made powerful men look ignorant in public. It undermined the authority of politicians, generals, priests, anyone who claimed to know what they were doing. In a culture that valued honor and reputation above almost everything, Socrates was going around Athens systematically humiliating the elite. But it was thrilling because it was honest. These men did not actually know what they claimed to know. They were operating on unexamined assumptions, inherited prejudices, and conventional wisdom. Socrates was revealing the truth that most people, including the powerful, were sleepwalking through life, never stopping to think clearly about the most important questions. What is justice? What is virtue? What is the good life? How should we live? Socrates was utterly different from the sophists, the professional teachers who dominated Athenian intellectual life. The sophists taught rhetoric, the art of persuasion, and they charged hefty fees. They promised to make young men successful, able to argue any side of any question and win in the assembly or the courts. Socrates despised them. He took no money. He claimed to teach nothing. He said he knew nothing. He was just asking questions. But in the questions, in the process of inquiry itself, something extraordinary happened. People began to think, not to accept inherited wisdom or clever arguments, but to actually examine their own beliefs and discover whether they held up under scrutiny. For Plato, this was transformative. Among the young men who gathered around Socrates were Plato's own relatives and friends. Cytus was there, brilliant and ambitious. Chamides, Plato's uncle, handsome and intelligent, also listened to Socrates. Alciades himself had been Socrates' companion before his political career consumed him. These were the gilded youth of Athens, and Socrates was teaching them without meaning to that everything their city took for granted might be wrong. The wisest man, Socrates insisted, is the one who knows that he knows nothing. The unexamined life is not worth living, and virtue, true virtue, was not inherited through noble blood or achieved through wealth and power. It was knowledge, understanding, the result of relentless questioning and honest thinking. For Plato, Socrates became more than a teacher. He became the model of what a human being could be, ugly on the outside, beautiful within, poor in material goods, rich in soul, powerless by the world's standards, and yet free in a way that generals and politicians could never be. But in 44 BC, Athens' long war finally ended in total defeat, and the consequences would bring horror to the city and force Socrates and his young followers into the centre of a nightmare. When Sparta finally strangled Athens into submission in 404 BC, the victors were not gentle. The long walls, those magnificent fortifications that connected Athens to its port at Piraeus and had protected the city for decades, were torn down to the sound of flutes. It was a humiliation, a public declaration that Athens' empire was finished. The Spartans installed a puppet government, and the men they chose to lead it were Athenian aristocrats, who had long believed that democracy was the source of all the city's problems. Critiers, Plato's mother's cousin, was among them. The 30, as they came to be known, seized power with Spartan backing and immediately launched a reign of terror. Their stated goal was to restore the ancestral constitution, to return Athens to the rule of the best men. In reality, they were a criminal gang with state power. Within months they had executed 1,500 Athenian citizens without trial. The targets were political enemies certainly, but also wealthy medics, foreign residents whose property could be confiscated. The 30 needed money to pay their Spartan garrison, and murder was an efficient form of fundraising. Plato's own uncle, Chamides, was part of this government. The young men who had sat at Socrates' feet asking questions about justice and virtue were now overseeing executions and prescriptions. The city lived in fear. Informants were everywhere. A denunciation could mean death. Property was seized. Families fled into exile, and Socrates refused to participate. The moment came when the 30 summoned Socrates along with 4 other men and ordered them to go to Salamis and arrest Leon, a wealthy and respected citizen, so that he could be executed and his property taken. It was a test of loyalty and a way to implicate more Athenians in the regime's crimes to spread the guilt so widely that resistance became impossible. Socrates listened to the order. Then he simply went home. He did not argue. He did not make a speech. He just refused. The other 4 went to Salamis and arrested Leon, who was duly murdered. Socrates did nothing, and in doing nothing committed an act of profound moral courage. He was already an old man in his 60s, obscure enough and odd enough that the 30 did not bother to punish him. But the message was clear. He would not be complicit, not even to save his own life. For Plato watching this, the contrast must have been unbearable. His own relatives, men of his own class, educated and cultured, were committing atrocities in the name of good government. And the strange barefoot philosopher, the man Athens mocked as eccentric and useless, was the only one with the moral clarity to say no. The reign of the 30 lasted only 8 months. Democratic exiles led by Thrasybulus gathered forces and marched on Athens. In the brief civil war that followed, Cytus and Cham were both killed fighting against the Democrats. The 30 fell there. Spartan backers withdrew and democracy was restored in 403 BC. But the restored democracy was not magnanimous. It was traumatized, bitter, paranoid. An amnesty was declared, forbidding prosecution for actions during the tyranny. But everyone knew who had collaborated and who had resisted. The city was divided, suspicious, looking for enemies within. And so the restored democracy, seeking scapegoats and determined to purge itself of any threat to stability, turned their eyes toward the man who had questioned everything. The man whose students had included both the worst tyrants and the most dangerous freethinkers Athens had ever produced. The trial took place in the spring of 399 BC, 4 years after the fall of the 30 tyrants, and the courtroom was thick with old resentments. Socrates was 70 years old, his body still vigorous despite the decades, his mind as sharp and unsettling as ever. The charges brought against him were vague but deadly. Impiety toward the gods of Athens and corrupting the youth. Behind the legal language lay a simpler accusation. Socrates asked too many questions, and some of his former students had become tyrants. 3 men stepped forward as his accusers. Meletus, a young poet of no particular distinction, claimed to represent the poet Socrates had mocked. Anytus, a wealthy tanner and democratic politician, spoke for the craftsmen and the restored democracy. Still nervous about aristocratic subversion, Lycon represented the rhetorics, the professional speakers whom Socrates had spent decades exposing as peddlers of mere persuasion rather than truth. Each had his reasons, but the real charge was unspoken. Socrates made people uncomfortable. He'd been doing it for 50 years, and Athens had had enough. The jury consisted of 500 citizens selected by lot, as was the democratic custom. They sat in a great semicircle, ordinary men, shopkeepers, farmers, soldiers, tasked with deciding whether the strange philosopher who haunted the agora deserved to live or die. Socrates could have won them over. Athenian juries were famously susceptible to emotional appeals. A few tears, some begging, perhaps bringing his 3 sons forward to plead for their father's life, and the verdict might have gone the other way. He did none of it. Instead, Socrates delivered a defense that was less a plea than a lecture. He questioned his accusers with the same relentless method he had always used, tying them in logical knots, making them look foolish. He explained that he had spent his life in service to Athens, acting on a divine mission to expose ignorance and push his fellow citizens toward wisdom. He said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And when asked to propose an alternative penalty to death, he suggested that Athens should feed him at public expense in the Tritonium, the greatest honour the city could bestow, reserved for Olympic victors and the city's greatest benefactors. The jurors were not amused. The first vote was close. 280 voted guilty, 220 for acquittal. A shift of just 30 votes would have freed him. But then came the penalty phase, and Socrates' contempt for the proceedings sealed his fate. The second vote was not close at all. 360 jurors voted for death. His defiance had convinced 80 men who thought him innocent that he deserved to die anyway. Socrates accepted the sentence with eerie calm. He told the jurors that he was not angry, that death might be a blessing, either a dreamless sleep or a journey to another place where he could continue his questioning with the great heroes of the past. Then he was led away to prison. A religious festival, the Dian mission honouring Apollo, delayed the execution for 30 days. The ship to Delos had already sailed, and no executions could take place until it returned. Socrates spent the month in chains in a small cell receiving visitors. His friends came desperate and grieving. They hatched a plan for his escape. Crito, one of his oldest companions, arranged everything: bribes for the guards, a safe route out of Athens, a place of refuge in Thessaly. Socrates refused. The conversation later recreated by Plato in the dialogue, Crito became one of the founding texts of Western ethics. Socrates argued that escaping would be unjust. He had lived his entire life in Athens benefiting from its laws, raising his children under its protection. To break those laws now simply because they worked against him would be to act on the principle that justice is whatever serves one's own interests. It would make him a hypocrite. If the law is unjust, he said, you work to change it, but you do not break it to save yourself. The law is greater than any individual. His friends wept. Socrates was unmoved. The final day came. The ship from Delos returned and the execution could proceed. The account of what happened was later written down by Phaedo, one of the young men present. Socrates spent his last hours in philosophical conversation discussing the immortality of the soul with perfect composure. When the jailer brought the cup of hemlock ground from the poisonous plant and mixed with water, Socrates took it without hesitation. He asked if he could pour a libation to the gods. The jailer said there was only enough for the fatal dose. Socrates smiled, drank it down in one steady motion, and then walked around the cell as instructed until his legs grew heavy. He lay down. The poison worked its way upward from his feet, numbing his body gradually. He remained conscious until the end, still talking, still calm. His last words were strange and have puzzled interpreters ever since. He said, "CTO, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it. Asclepius was the god of healing. The sacrifice of a rooster was a traditional offering after recovery from illness." Was Socrates suggesting that death was a cure, a healing, a release from the sickness of life? No one knows. Then he was still. Crito closed his eyes. Plato was not there. The account records that Plato was ill. Whether this was physical illness or an excuse, a way to avoid witnessing what he could not bear to see, remains one of the small mysteries of history. Guilt, perhaps, or simply grief too overwhelming to face. The man who would spend the rest of his life writing dialogues in which Socrates was the hero, the protagonist of nearly every conversation, could not bring himself to watch his teacher die. Plato would spend the rest of his life trying to answer one question. How could the best man be killed by the worst system? In the immediate aftermath of Socrates' execution, fear gripped his followers. The democracy had just demonstrated its willingness to kill a 70-year-old man for asking questions. Association with Socrates was now dangerous, a potential mark of disloyalty to the city. Plato, already from a family tainted by the crimes of the 30, had every reason to leave Athens. He fled to Megara, a small city-state about 25 miles west of Athens, across the Isthmus of Corinth. He was not alone. A small group of Socrates' closest students made the same journey, seeking refuge with Euclid of Megara, not the famous mathematician, but a philosopher who had been devoted to Socrates and who had risked his life sneaking into Athens during the 30s reign to hear the master speak. Euclid welcomed them into his home, and for a time the Socratic circle reconstituted itself in exile, talking, debating, trying to make sense of what had happened. But Plato could not stay still. Over the next 12 years, from 399 to 387 BC, he travelled widely, searching for something Athens could no longer provide. The exact itinerary is uncertain, reconstructed from fragments and later biographical traditions, but the broad outline is clear. He was looking for wisdom, for mathematical and philosophical knowledge, for a way to understand the world that did not end in hemlock and injustice. Some ancient sources claim he travelled to Cyrene, a Greek city on the coast of North Africa in what is now Libya. There he would have studied mathematics with Theodorus, a geometer whose work on irrational numbers fascinated the Greeks. Mathematics was becoming central to Plato's thinking, a realm of certainty and eternal truth in contrast to the flux and chaos of political life. Other traditions insist he went to Egypt, spending time with the priests of Memphis and Heliopolis, learning their ancient wisdom. Modern scholars are skeptical. There is no solid evidence for the Egyptian journey, and it may be a later invention. Part of the tendency to give Greek philosophy an exotic pedigree. But whether or not Plato actually walked along the Nile, the story reflects something true. He was searching far beyond Athens for answers. What is certain is that he travelled to southern Italy, to the Greek colonies there, and that this journey changed him. In the city of Tarentum, Plato met Archytas, one of the most remarkable men of the age. Archytas was a Pythagorean, a follower of the semi-legendary Pythagoras who had lived a century earlier and founded a philosophical and religious movement. But Archytas was not a mere mystic. He was a brilliant mathematician, a scientist who worked on problems in geometry and acoustics, and he was also a statesman, elected general of Tarentum multiple times and respected as a just and effective leader. Here was the possibility Plato was searching for a philosopher who actually ruled and ruled well. The Pythagoreans believed that numbers were the foundation of reality, not just useful for counting or measuring, but the actual substance of the cosmos. Musical harmony, they discovered, could be expressed in mathematical ratios. The intervals that sound beautiful to the ear, the octave, the fifth, the fourth, correspond to simple numerical proportions. If beauty and sound was mathematical, perhaps all beauty was. Perhaps the entire structure of the universe, from the movements of the stars to the virtues of the soul, was ultimately numerical. They also believed in the transmigration of souls, reincarnation. The soul was immortal, divine, but trapped in the body, a prison from which it could only escape through purification. Philosophy, mathematics, and a strict way of life, vegetarianism, communal living, silence, and discipline were the means of purification. The physical world was imperfect, decaying, untrustworthy. But the world of number of eternal mathematical truths was perfect, unchanging, real in a way that material things could never be. For Plato, devastated by Athens and haunted by Socrates' death, this was a revelation. Here was a framework that made sense of his experience. The perfect justice he sought did not exist in Athens or any physical city, because physical things are always flawed, always changing. But perhaps justice existed in a higher realm, a realm of eternal perfect forms accessible through reason and mathematics. The seeds of his most famous doctrine, the theory of forms, were planted in the gardens and meeting halls of the Pythagorean communities in southern Italy. But it was on the island of Sicily that Plato's travels would take a dramatic and dangerous turn, bringing him face to face with power in its most brutal form. Syracuse was the richest and most powerful Greek city in the western Mediterranean, a sprawling metropolis on the eastern coast of Sicily. It had grown wealthy from trade and conquest, and for nearly 40 years it had been ruled by Dionysius I, one of the most successful tyrants of the Greek world. Tyrant in the Greek sense did not necessarily mean a cruel ruler, though Dionysius could certainly be cruel. It meant someone who had seized power unconstitutionally and ruled through force rather than law. Dionysius had done exactly that, transforming Syracuse into a military powerhouse and himself into an absolute ruler. His court was a study in contradictions. There was immense luxury. Banquets, poets, musicians, playwrights brought in from across the Greek world. Dionysius himself fancied himself a tragic poet and forced audiences to sit through his plays. But there was also pervasive paranoia. The tyrant trusted no one. He slept in a different room each night. He had his barber executed and afterwards shaved himself with a hot coal, rather than risk a blade near his throat. The treasury was protected by a moat crossed by a single drawbridge, which only Dionysius could lower from inside. Plato arrived in Syracuse sometime around 388 or 387 BC, now about 40 years old. The reasons for his visit are unclear. Perhaps he was simply travelling, continuing his education in the Greek West. Perhaps he was invited by the court, his growing reputation as a philosopher and association with the Pythagoreans making him a curiosity. Whatever brought him, he soon found himself at the centre of attention. He met a young man named Dion, the brother-in-law of Dionysius, married to the tyrant's sister. Dion was in his early 20s, aristocratic, educated, and profoundly dissatisfied with the life of empty luxury and moral corruption surrounding him. When he encountered Plato and heard him speak about philosophy, about the life dedicated to truth and virtue, something ignited. Dion became Plato's student and devote. Convinced that philosophy could transform not just individuals but entire cities, Plato, for his part, began to lecture at the court. He spoke about justice, virtue, and the nature of true rulership, and at some point, with characteristic boldness or profound naivety, he began to criticize tyranny itself. He argued that tyrants, despite their power, were not truly free. They were slaves to their own fears, surrounded by enemies, real and imagined, unable to trust anyone or live without constant anxiety. A ruler who governed through violence and deception was a prisoner of his own system. Only a philosopher, someone who understood the good and lived virtuously, could rule justly and be genuinely happy. Dionysius I was not pleased. The details of what happened next vary in ancient accounts, but the outcome was clear. Plato had insulted his host and overstepped badly. Whether through a direct order or a more subtle arrangement, Dionysius arranged for Plato's departure from Syracuse to become permanent. He handed the philosopher over to a Spartan ambassador, Pace, who was returning home by ship. The ship stopped at the island of Ina, a small state that had been at war with Athens on and off for years and harboured deep hatred for Athenians. There, Pace sold Plato into slavery. It was a calculated humiliation and a death sentence barely averted. Slaves had no rights. Plato could have ended his days labouring in a workshop or a farm, his freedom and his future erased. But fortune intervened in the form of a man named Aniceris, a philosopher from Cyrene who happened to be on Ina. Aniceris recognized Plato, understood who he was, and purchased his freedom, paying the ransom. Some accounts say 20 minas, others 30, enough to buy a skilled slave. Plato returned to Athens, shaken, humiliated, but also strangely determined. He had attempted to bring philosophy directly into contact with political power, to persuade a tyrant through argument and reason. The result had been disaster. Philosophy and brute power, it seemed, spoke different languages. The tyrant cared nothing for arguments about the good. He cared about control, survival, dominance. And yet Plato was not ready to abandon the question, can philosophy ever truly change politics? Or must the two remain forever separate, the realm of wisdom and the realm of power never to meet? Back in Athens, now 40 years old, Plato made a decision that would echo through millennia and transform the world's understanding of education itself. In 387 BC, Plato purchased a plot of land in a sacred grove about a mile northwest of Athens' walls. The land was named after Acadamus, a legendary Athenian hero, and it was a place of olive trees, shade, and quiet streams, a refuge from the dust and noise of the city. Here, Plato founded a school. He called it the Academy. It was not the first place in Athens where philosophy was taught. The sophists had their students and other philosophers gathered followers, but those were temporary arrangements centered on a single teacher's lifetime. The Academy was different. It was permanent, institutional, a community dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge that would outlast its founder. It was in effect the world's first university. The school had no grand buildings at first, just the natural setting of the grove and a few simple structures for lectures and dining. But it had something far more important, a vision of education as a systematic, collaborative, lifelong pursuit. Students did not come to the academy to learn a skill or prepare for a career the way they might with the sophist. They came to pursue truth. Mathematics was the foundation of the curriculum, and it was treated as the gateway to philosophy, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, harmonics. These were not separate subjects, but interconnected paths toward understanding the structure of reality. According to later tradition, an inscription was placed over the entrance to the academy. "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." The saying may be apocryphal, but it captures the spirit perfectly. Mathematics train the mind to think about eternal, unchanging truths, to move beyond the senses and the physical world toward pure reason. Only after mastering mathematics would a student move on to dialectic, the formalized version of the Socratic method. Here students learn to argue rigorously, to define terms precisely, to expose contradictions, and to construct logical proofs. Philosophy for Plato was not about memorizing doctrines. It was about learning how to think. The academy drew students from across the Greek world, young men from wealthy families eager for an education that offered more than rhetoric and politics made the journey to Athens to study with Plato. But the school was not exclusively male. At least 2 women are known to have studied there, including Axiothea of Philius, who according to tradition wore men's clothing to attend the lectures. In a culture where women were largely excluded from public intellectual life, this was radical. And it was in the academy, amidst the olive trees and philosophical debates, that Plato began to write the works that would define his legacy. He composed dialogues, dramatic conversations that placed Socrates at the centre, reconstructing his method and his voice. The early dialogues written soon after Socrates' death were probably close to actual conversations Plato had witnessed, short, inconclusive, focused on defining a single concept like piety or courage. But as Plato matured, the dialogues became longer, more complex, less tied to the historical Socrates, and more vehicles for Plato's own developed philosophy. He wrote the Symposium, a brilliant exploration of love set at a drinking party. He wrote the Phaedo, dramatizing Socrates' final hours and arguing for the immortality of the soul. He wrote the Meno, demonstrating that learning is recollection, the soul remembering truths it knew before birth. The dialogues were works of literature as much as philosophy, with vivid characters, humour and drama. They were meant to be read aloud, shared, discussed, and they kept Socrates alive. Decades after his death, Socrates remained the protagonist, the questioner, the moral centre. Plato ensured that his teacher's voice would never be silenced. The academy became a living organism of inquiry. Students and teachers walked the garden paths, debating under the trees. They held symposia, philosophical drinking parties where ideas flowed alongside wine. They studied the stars, mapped geometric proofs, and challenged each other's assumptions. It was a community bound not by family or politics, but by shared commitment to understanding. And in the year 367 BC, when Plato was 60 years old, a 17-year-old student from the northern kingdom of Macedon arrived at the academy's entrance. His name was Aristotle, and he would stay for 20 years, becoming Plato's greatest student and eventually his greatest critic. But even as Plato built his school of wisdom, spending his days teaching and his evenings writing, he was crafting something else, a vision of a perfect city, a blueprint for justice that would scandalize and inspire readers for the next 2,000 years. The Republic is Plato's longest and most famous dialogue, written sometime in the 380s or 370s BC during his mature period at the Academy. It is framed as a conversation that Socrates had years earlier, recounted by him the day after it occurred. The setting is the Piraeus, Athens port, at the home of a wealthy foreign resident. The initial question seems simple. Is justice more profitable than injustice? Is it better to be a just person who appears unjust or an unjust person who appears just? To answer, Socrates proposes a thought experiment. Justice in an individual soul is hard to see, being small and subtle. But if we imagine justice writ large in an entire city, it might become visible, easier to examine. So the group sets out to construct in speech a perfectly just city from the ground up. They begin with basics, A city needs farmers to produce food, builders to make houses, weavers for clothing. Specialization and trade emerge naturally. But a city also needs protectors, warriors to defend it from external threats. These guardians must have a unique temperament, spirited and courageous toward enemies, but gentle toward their own people. They are like noble dogs, fierce to strangers, but loyal to their masters. The education of these guardians becomes crucial. They must be trained from childhood in music and gymnastics, not for entertainment or athleticism, but to shape their souls. Music and poetry cultivate gentleness and harmony. Gymnastics cultivate courage and discipline. But not all poetry is acceptable. Plato shockingly proposes censoring Homer and Hesiod, the foundational texts of Greek culture, because they depict the gods behaving badly, lying, committing adultery, acting out of jealousy and spite. If the guardians believe the gods are immoral, they will think immorality is divine. Only stories that portray virtue should be allowed. As the ideal city takes shape, it divides into 3 classes, each corresponding to a part of the human soul. The producers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants represent appetite, the desiring part of the soul that seeks food, wealth, and pleasure. The auxiliaries, the warrior class, represent spirit, the part of the soul that feels anger, pride, and the drive to honor. And the guardians, the rulers, represent reason, the part that understands, judges, and governs. Justice in the city, Socrates argues, is each class doing its proper work. The producers produce, the auxiliaries protect, the guardians rule. No class interferes with another, and justice in the individual soul is the same. Reason ruling, spirit supporting reason, and appetite obeying, all parts in harmony. But the most controversial proposals concern the guardians themselves. To prevent them from developing private interests that might conflict with the city's good, Plato strips them of private property. They own nothing. They live communally, fed by the state, sharing everything. Even more radically, they have no private families. Children are raised collectively by the state. Parents do not know which children are theirs, and children do not know their parents. This prevents nepotism and ensures that guardians care for the city as a whole, not just their own bloodlines. And in a move almost unthinkable in the 380s BC, Plato insists that women can be guardians equal to men. If a woman has the nature and ability to be a guardian, if she's intelligent, courageous, and loves wisdom, then she should be educated and trained exactly as men are. Gender is irrelevant to virtue. This was radical, a direct challenge to Greek assumptions about the natural inferiority of women. But who rules in this city? Not just any guardian, only the philosopher-kings. Those rare individuals who've been educated for decades in mathematics and dialectic and have come to understand the forms, the eternal truths that lie beyond the physical world. Only those who have seen the form of the good itself, the highest reality, the source of all truth and being, are fit to rule. Plato explains this through one of the most famous images in Western philosophy, the Allegory of the cave. Imagine, Socrates says, prisoners chained in a dark cave since childhood facing a wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners people carry objects. The prisoners see only shadows cast on the wall. They know nothing else. The shadows are their reality. Now imagine one prisoner is freed. He turns and sees the fire, the objects, the people. It is painful, confusing. He's dragged out of the cave into the sunlight. At first he is blinded. Gradually his eyes adjust. He sees trees, sky, and finally the sun itself, the source of all light and life. He understands that everything in the cave was an illusion, a pale reflection of the real world above. This, Plato says, is the journey of the philosopher. Most people live their entire lives seeing only shadows, physical objects, opinions, conventional beliefs. The philosopher, through education, especially mathematics, escapes the cave and sees reality as it truly is, the realm of eternal forms culminating in the form of the good, which is like the sun illuminating and giving being to everything else. But the philosopher cannot stay in the light. Justice requires that he return to the cave, to the world of politics and human affairs, to rule. He does so reluctantly, out of duty, not desire. He would prefer to remain in contemplation. But the city needs him, and so he descends back into the darkness to free others. The Republic ends with a myth, the myth of air, a soldier who dies in battle and returns to life to tell what he saw in the afterlife. Souls are judged. The just are rewarded, the unjust punished. Then souls choose their next lives. Most choose foolishly, seduced by power or pleasure. Odysseus, wisest of all, chooses a quiet, simple life, having learned from his suffering. The soul is immortal, Plato insists, and how we live matters for eternity. The Republic was and remains deeply controversial. Is it a sincere blueprint for a perfect state, or a warning about what perfection would require? The abolition of family, the censorship, the rule by a philosophical elite. These ideas have inspired utopians and horrified lovers of freedom for centuries. But at its heart, the dialogue is asking a question Plato could not escape. What is justice, and can it ever truly exist in a human city? But what are these forms that Plato believed were more real than the world we touch and see? And how did he come to believe in a realm of perfect eternal truths invisible to the eye? The problem that haunted Plato was the problem that had troubled Greek thinkers for generations. How can we have genuine knowledge of a world that never stops changing? Heresitus, the philosopher from Ephesus, had said, "You cannot step into the same river twice. The water is always flowing, always different." But Heraclitus went further. Everything is in constant flux. Your body changes from moment to moment, cells dying and being born, the mountain erodes, the tree grows and decays. If everything is always changing, how can we know anything? Knowledge requires stability, something permanent to grasp, but the physical world offers none. Plato's answer was radical and would define Western philosophy for the next 2,000 years. There are not one but two realms of reality. The first is the physical world we see and touch, the world of becoming. This is the realm of particular things, this horse, that tree, this beautiful face. Everything here is imperfect, constantly changing, coming into being and passing away. We access it through our senses, and precisely because it is always in flux, we cannot have true knowledge of it, only opinion. The second realm is invisible, accessible only through reason. This is the realm of the forms, eternal, perfect, unchanging realities that exist independently of any mind. They are more real than physical objects. In fact, physical objects are real only to the extent that they participate in the forms. Consider beauty. In the physical world, we encounter many beautiful things. A face, a sunset, a statue. Each is beautiful in different ways, and each will eventually cease to exist. But the form of beauty itself, the perfect eternal standard by which we judge all beautiful things, never changes. It does not exist in space or time, it simply is. Or take circles. A geometer can draw a circle in the sand, but examine it closely, and it is never perfect. The line has thickness, it wobbles. Yet when we prove theorems about circles, We're not proving anything about these flawed physical drawings. We're proving truths about the perfect form of the circle, which no one has ever seen with physical eyes. This is why mathematics was so important to Plato. Mathematics deals directly with the forms. The truths of geometry are eternal, not dependent on the physical world. The Pythagorean theorem was true before humans existed, and will be true after the last human dies. But if the forms are eternal and separate from us, how do we know them? Plato's answer is recollection, anamnesis. Learning is not acquiring new information, but remembering what the soul already knows. In the Menau dialogue, Socrates demonstrates this with the slave boy who has never studied geometry. Through careful questioning without teaching him anything directly, Socrates leads the boy to discover a complex geometric truth. How is this possible? The boy's soul knew the truth before birth when it existed in the realm of forms. Education is midwifery, helping the soul give birth to knowledge it already possesses but has forgotten. At the pinnacle of all forms stands the form of the good, the highest reality. Plato struggled to describe it, resorting to analogies. The form of the good is to the intelligible realm what the sun is to the visible world. The sun makes physical objects visible and gives them life. The form of the good makes the forms intelligible and gives them reality. Even Plato himself seemed uncertain about the boundaries of his theory. Are there forms of mud, hair, dirt? In the Parmenides dialogue, a young Socrates is confronted with exactly these uncomfortable questions. Plato seems troubled, unsure. His greatest student Aristotle would later reject the forms entirely, arguing they solve nothing and multiply mysteries. But for Plato, the forms were the only way to make sense of a world where Socrates could die and justice could seemingly fail. Yet truth and goodness remained real, untouched by Athenian juries or hemlock. While Plato taught that souls remember eternal truths, he also believed those souls travelled through many lives, carrying the consequences of their choices across the boundary of death. The soul for Plato was not a metaphor. It was the truest part of a human being, more real than flesh or bone, and it was immortal. The fullest exploration appears in the Phaedo, the dialogue set on Socrates' final day. As the old philosopher waits for the hemlock, his friends grieve. If death is the end, their loss is absolute. But Socrates insists they have misunderstood. The body dies, but the soul cannot die. For the philosopher, death is not catastrophe, but liberation. Plato presents several arguments through Socrates' voice. The cyclical argument suggests opposites come from opposites. Sleep from waking, waking from sleep. So life must come from death, and death from life. The argument from recollection implies the soul existed before birth, and therefore must survive death. The affinity argument claims the soul being simple and indivisible, like the forms cannot decompose the way composite material things do. These arguments reveal Plato's vision of human nature. We are not bodies that happen to have souls. We are souls temporarily embodied. Plato describes the soul as having three parts. Reason is the highest, immortal and divine, capable of grasping the forms. Spirit is the seat of courage, anger, pride, the drive for honour. Appetite is the lowest, desiring food, drink, sex, wealth. In a just soul, reason rules, spirit supports reason, and appetite obeys. When this harmony breaks down, the soul becomes disordered and unhappy. But the soul's existence does not end with one lifetime. After death comes judgment. The Phaedo describes the soul's journey. Those who have lived justly and philosophically, who have purified themselves through virtue and wisdom, ascend to a blessed existence. but souls corrupted by injustice face punishment, purification through suffering and then reincarnation. The myth of Air closing the Republic offers a vivid picture. Air is a soldier killed in battle who returns to life to report what he witnessed. Souls are judged. The just ascend for 1,000 years of reward. The unjust descend for 1,000 years of punishment. Then all souls choose their next lives. Most choose foolishly. A man who lived virtuously by habit chooses the life of a tyrant, seduced by power, not realizing the misery it brings. The soul of Orpheus chooses to be reborn as a swan. Ajax chooses the life of a lion. But Odysseus, wisest of all, having wandered and suffered, chooses last. He selects the life of a private man, obscure and humble. He has learned that the quiet life of contemplation is worth more than the glory of kings. The cycle of reincarnation can be escaped. This is philosophy's ultimate goal. By living virtuously, by training the soul to care for truth rather than pleasure, by practicing mathematics and dialectic, the philosopher purifies the soul. At death, such a soul does not return to rebirth, but escapes to the realm of the forms. Philosophy, Plato says, is the practice of dying. Philosophers spend their lives training the soul to separate from the body. The Greek word play is deliberate. Soma body is sema tomb. Death for the philosopher is release. This vision owes much to the Orphic and Pythagorean mystery religions Plato encountered in southern Italy, but transformed through rigorous philosophical argument. But Plato's beliefs about the soul in its journey would be tested by the most painful personal losses, by love given and violently taken away. Plato never married. He had no children, at least none recorded by history. For a man of his class and wealth, this was unusual. Athenian aristocrats were expected to marry, produce heirs, continue the family line. That Plato did not suggest a deliberate choice, a life organized around something other than conventional domesticity. Ancient sources hint at relationships with young men which would not have been scandalous in Athens. Such relationships were a recognized part of aristocratic culture. A poem attributed to Plato addressed to a young man named Aster survives. Stargazing Aster, would I were the heavens to gaze upon you with many eyes. Its authenticity is disputed, but it captures a longing, a desire turned skyward. What is certain is that Plato thought deeply about love, and his meditation appears in the Symposium written between 385 and 370 BC. The setting is a drinking party at the house of Agathon, a tragic poet celebrating a victory. The guests, including Socrates, deliver speeches praising Eros, the god of love. Each offers a different vision. Aristophanes, the comic playwright, tells a myth. Originally, humans were spherical creatures with 4 arms and 4 legs. Zeus split them in half as punishment. Now, each of us is incomplete, wandering through life, searching for our other half. Love is the desire to be reunited, to become whole again. But Socrates' speech carries Plato's teaching. Socrates claims he learned about love from Diotima, a priestess wise in divine matters. Whether she was historical or Plato's invention is unknown. Diotima teaches that love is desire, and desire is always for what we lack. We love beauty because we do not possess it. Eros seeks not temporary satisfaction but permanence, immortality. She describes a ladder of love and ascent. A young person begins by loving a single beautiful body, physical attraction. But if educated properly, that person comes to see beauty in all bodies, valuing the form they share rather than the individual. From there, the ascent continues. The lover begins to love beautiful souls more than bodies, valuing virtue over physical appearance. then beautiful laws and institutions, then beautiful knowledge, and finally at the summit, the lover beholds beauty itself, the form of beauty, eternal and perfect. This vision is mystical, the soul's erotic energy fully transformed into philosophical contemplation. This is what would later be called Platonic love, though that phrase risks misunderstanding. Plato does not denigrate physical attraction. The body is the first rung of the ladder. Without it, the ascent cannot begin, but the goal is to transform desire, to channel it upward, to redirect toward the eternal. The Symposium ends with Alcibiades crashing the party drunk. He delivers a speech praising not but Socrates, describing his failed attempt to seduce the philosopher. Alcibiades, one of the most beautiful men in Athens, threw himself at Socrates, but Socrates simply talked to him all night about virtue, and in the morning left unmoved. Alcibiades is bewildered and in awe. It is a picture of the philosopher immune to bodily desires, tyranny, loving beauty but loving the form more than any particular instance. For Plato, this transformation of love was the highest fulfillment of desire, directing it toward what truly satisfies, truth, goodness, beauty itself. As Plato entered his 60s, the academy flourishing, a message arrived from Sicily that would pull him back into the dangerous world of tyrants and power. In 367 BC, Dionysius I, tyrant of Syracuse for 38 years, died. His son, Dionysius II, inherited the throne. He was young, untrained, insecure, and surrounded by flatterers and rivals. Into this volatile situation stepped Dion, now middle-aged, still devoted Plato, convinced he saw an opportunity that would never come again. Dion sent urgent letters to Athens. The young tyrant could be educated. He was not yet hardened into cruelty like his father. If Plato came to Syracuse and became his teacher, Dionysius II could be transformed into a philosopher-king. The Republic could be made real. Plato was 60 years old. He had been teaching at the academy for 2 decades. He had students, projects, a life of relative peace. He had no illusions about Syracuse's dangers. His first visit had ended in slavery. But Dion's appeal struck at the core of Plato's convictions. If philosophy could not change the world, what was it for? If the ideal city could never be more than words, then what had been the point? Duty to Dion, duty to his own principles, and perhaps a flicker of hope compelled him. He left Aristotle, now about 20 years old and already formidable, in charge of the academy. Then he boarded a ship for Sicily. The initial signs were promising. Dionysius II greeted Plato with enthusiasm and public honour. The palace became a makeshift academy. Geometric diagrams appeared on the floors where courtiers walked. Aristocrats began discussing philosophy, or at least pretending to, because the tyrant's favour seemed to depend on it. It looked briefly like success, but appearances were deceiving. Dionysius II was intelligent enough to be fascinated by philosophy, but too weak-willed to truly embrace it. And Dion's position at court as the tyrant's brother-in-law and a man of principle and popularity made him dangerous. Rivals whispered that Dion was using Plato to manipulate the tyrant, perhaps to plot a coup. Dionysius II, pulled between admiration for Plato and fear of Dion, made a choice. He exiled Dion. He confiscated Dion's property and sent him away from Syracuse, claiming it was temporary for security, nothing personal, and he kept Plato. Plato was now in an impossible position. He was a guest who could not leave, a teacher whose best student had been banished, a philosopher trapped in a court where philosophy was decoration, not discipline. Dionysius II did not want wisdom. He wanted the prestige of having a famous philosopher at his side, the appearance of enlightenment without the difficult work of becoming just. Months passed. Plato made clear he wished to return to Athens. Dionysius II delayed, made excuses, promised it would be soon. The situation became a polite imprisonment. Finally, after nearly a year, the tyrant allowed him to depart, but only after securing Plato's vague promise to return someday, and only after making clear that Dion's fate depended on Plato's continued cooperation. Plato sailed back to Athens, furious and heartbroken. The experiment had failed utterly. The young tyrant had proven exactly what Plato feared. That power without philosophy is tyranny, and tyranny cannot be educated because it does not truly want to learn. It wants only to maintain control. The academy welcomed him back. His students listened as he recounted the disaster, and Plato returned to his writing, his teaching, convinced now that the philosopher-king was an ideal that could exist only in speech, never in the corrupted mess of actual politics. But the tyrant of Syracuse was not finished with the old philosopher, and the tragedy of Dion had only begun. In 361 BC, 6 years after Plato's second visit, another message arrived from Syracuse. Dionysius II was sending a ship to Athens with an invitation, almost a summons. The tyrant promised that if Plato returned, he would reconcile with Dion, restore his property, and genuinely commit to philosophy. This time it would be different. Plato was 66 years old. He did not believe Dionysius. How could he? But Dion sent letters pleading. So did other friends, including architects of Tarentum, the Pythagorean philosopher-statesman who had helped Plato before. They all argued that Plato had an obligation to Dion, to his friendships, to the very principles he taught. Against his better judgment, against students who begged him not to go, Plato boarded the ship. He arrived to find, as expected, that the promises were lies. Dionysius II had no intention of restoring Dion. The young tyrant wanted Plato as a trophy, proof of sophistication, but he had no desire to change his life or his rule. Dionysius confiscated Plato's property in Syracuse. Plato was moved to a garden within the palace complex, essentially imprisoned. His movements were restricted. Mercenaries watched him. At one point his life was openly threatened by soldiers who resented his presence. Plato managed to send a secret message to Archytas in Tarentum asking for help. Archytas responded by sending an official embassy to Syracuse demanding Plato's release on diplomatic grounds. Dionysius, not wanting an international incident with powerful Tarentum, reluctantly let Plato go. The aging philosopher escaped Syracuse for the third and final time. He returned to Athens and made a vow. He would never set foot in Sicily again. Philosophy and tyranny were incompatible. The dream of the philosopher-king, at least in that form, was dead. But the story of Syracuse was not over. Dion, still in exile, had spent the years gathering resources and allies. In 357 BC, he launched a daring invasion of Syracuse with a small force of mercenaries. The city, weary of Dionysius II's erratic rule, welcomed Dion. The tyrant fled. Dion took control and began haltingly to implement reforms inspired by Plato's teachings. For a brief moment it seemed possible. A student of philosophy, governing justly, reshaping a city according to reason. But Syracuse was poisoned by decades of tyranny, faction, and violence. Dion faced resistance from democrats who wanted popular rule, from oligarchs who wanted power, from mercenaries who wanted pay, and from ordinary citizens who simply wanted stability. Dion, for all his philosophical training, proved unable to navigate the chaos. He became isolated, autocratic, desperate. In 354 BC, just 3 years after his triumph, Dion was assassinated. The murderer was Callippus, a supposed friend and fellow student of Plato, a man who had fought alongside Dion and then betrayed him for power. Syracuse collapsed into civil war, a nightmare of competing tyrants and factions. Plato, now in his 70s, received the news in Athens. His closest friend was dead, murdered not by an enemy, but by someone from within the philosophical circle, someone who'd learned to speak about justice while pursuing only his own ambition. In the aftermath, Plato wrote letters to the surviving faction in Syracuse, including the famous seventh letter. In it, he reflects on the catastrophe. He concludes that philosophy and politics are fundamentally incompatible in a corrupt state. A true philosopher cannot rule justly where the people are not educated, where institutions are decayed, where power is seized by violence. The great experiment was over, ended in blood and failure. Returning to Athens for the final time, an aging Plato turned away from politics and deeper into the cosmos of thought, spending his last years refining his vision of reality. After 360 BC, as Plato entered his 60s, his writing changed. The dialogues became longer, denser, more technical, and in some of them Socrates no longer appeared as the protagonist. It was as if Plato, having spent decades channeling his philosophy through his teacher's voice, was finally stepping forward to speak in his own. The Tous is a creation myth, but not the poetic kind found in Hesiod. It is a mathematical and cosmological vision of how the universe came to be. Plato introduces a figure called the demiurge, a craftsman god who does not create the world from nothing, but rather imposes order on pre-existing chaos. The demiurge looks to the eternal forms as templates and shapes, the physical world as an imperfect copy, the best possible reflection of perfection in matter. The basic elements earth, water, air, fire are composed of geometric solids. Earth is the cube, stable and grounded. Fire is the tetrahedron, sharp and aggressive. Water is the iosohedron, smooth and flowing. Air is the octahedron. These shapes, later called the Platonic solids, are not arbitrary but necessary, the mathematical forms that underlie physical reality. The demiurge also creates the world's soul, a living intelligence that pervades the cosmos, giving it motion and harmony. The heavenly spheres move in perfect mathematical ratios, producing the harmony of the spheres, a cosmic music too pure for human ears. Time itself, Plato writes, is the moving image of eternity, a way for the changing world to imitate, however imperfectly, the unchanging realm of forms. The Tous became one of Plato's most influential works, the only dialogue widely available in the medieval West for centuries, shaping Christian cosmology and Islamic philosophy. The Critias, a sequel to the Tmos, was never finished. It tells the story of Atlantis, a vast island civilization that existed 9,000 years before Plato's time. Ancient Athens, small and virtuous, fought against Atlantis, a powerful but corrupt empire. Atlantis was a marvel of engineering, concentric rings of water and land, abundant resources, mighty fleets. But its people grew arrogant, forgetting virtue in their pursuit of wealth and conquest. The gods judged them, and in a single day and night, Atlantis sank beneath the sea. The dialogue breaks off mid-sentence. Why Plato abandoned it is unknown. But the story of Atlantis survived, becoming a foundation for centuries of speculation, esoteric interpretations, and doomed searches for a lost continent. The Laws is Plato's longest work, a massive dialogue written in his final years. It is also his most pessimistic. Where the Republic imagined a perfect city ruled by philosopher-kings, the Laws describes a second-best city, a realistic constitution for actual human beings who are not and never will be philosophers. The tone is austere, the vision darker. There is no abolition of private property, no communal child-rearing, no radical equality of women. Instead, there is a detailed legal code covering everything from marriage laws to religious festivals, property disputes to drunkenness. A nocturnal council, a small elite body, guards the laws and ensures the city does not drift into corruption. It is philosophy tempered by experience, idealism chastened by failure. And in the Peloponnesians, Plato does something astonishing. He subjects his own theory of forms to devastating critique. A young Socrates, eager and confident, presents the theory to the elder philosopher Peloponnesian, who dismantles it with logical precision. The famous third man argument. If a form explains the similarity between two things, then we need another form to explain the similarity between those things. Then the form itself leading to infinite regress. The problems multiply. Socrates has no answers. Is Plato rejecting his life's work or deepening it, showing that even the forms require more careful thought than his earlier dialogues admitted? The dialogue ends in paradox, unresolved. These late works show a mind still restless, still questioning, even turning its scrutiny inward. Within the Academy's gardens, a brilliant student was developing ideas that would challenge his master's most fundamental beliefs, setting the stage for a philosophical rivalry that would echo through the centuries. In 367 BC, the same year Plato sailed to Syracuse on his disastrous second journey, a 17-year-old boy from the northern kingdom of Macedon arrived at the gates of the Academy. His name was Aristotle. His father had been court physician to the Macedonian king, but both parents were dead, and Aristotle had come to Athens with his inheritance and a hunger for knowledge. He would stay for 20 years. Plato, returning from Syracuse and resuming his teaching, recognized the boy's brilliance immediately. According to later tradition, he called Aristotle the mind, nous in Greek, a tribute to his intellectual sharpness. But Plato also supposedly called him the foe, the young horse that kicks, a warning that this student would not simply absorb doctrine but challenge it. In the early years, Aristotle's work was Platonic in spirit. He wrote dialogues in imitation of his teacher, now lost. He accepted the immortality of the soul, the importance of mathematics, the centrality of ethics. But gradually a different approach emerged, rooted in a different temperament. Where Plato looked upward to eternal forms, Aristotle looked downward to the living world. He was fascinated by biology, by the diversity of animal life, by the processes of growth and reproduction. He dissected sea creatures on the island of Lesbos, cataloguing their anatomy, observing their behavior, building a massive empirical foundation for a science of life. Knowledge, Aristotle came to believe, begins not with reason contemplating the eternal, but the senses observing the particular. This led him to reject the forms. Why posit a separate realm of perfect templates when we can explain universals as patterns that exist within particular things? The form of horse does not exist in some transcendent heaven. Horseness is simply what all individual horses have in common, abstracted by the mind from observation. The forms are unnecessary, a metaphysical extravagance that solves no problems and creates new ones. The debates between Plato and Aristotle must have been intense, walking the garden paths of the Academy, surrounded by students who took sides. Later tradition attributed to Aristotle the saying, "Plato is dear to me, but truth is dearer." Whether he actually said it is uncertain, but it captures the spirit. Raphael's great Renaissance painting The School of Athens immortalized their difference. In the center of the fresco, Plato stands pointing upward toward the heavens, toward the realm of eternal forms. Beside him, Aristotle gestures horizontally, his hands sweeping toward the earth, toward the physical world we inhabit. Two gestures, two philosophies, two ways of understanding reality. For 20 years, Aristotle remained at the academy, learning, teaching, writing, arguing. But when Plato died in 347 BC, the leadership of the school did not pass to him. Speusippus, Plato's nephew, was chosen as Scoloch, head of the academy. The choice was perhaps political, perhaps personal. Aristotle was a foreigner, a Macedonian, and Athens was increasingly hostile to Macedon's growing power. Or perhaps Speusippus and the inner circle felt Aristotle had drifted too far from the master's teachings. Whatever the reason, Aristotle left Athens. He spent time in Assos in Asia Minor and on the island of Lesbos. Eventually he was summoned to Macedon to tutor the young Prince Alexander, the boy who had become Alexander the Great. And later still, he returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum, a rival to the academy. Plato and Aristotle became the two pillars of Western philosophy, their influence intertwined and inseparable. Plato gave the West rationalism, idealism, the belief that mathematics and reason can grasp a reality beyond the senses. Aristotle gave it empiricism, logic, the conviction that careful observation of nature is the path to knowledge. Christianity would eventually synthesize both. Augustine was a Platonist, seeing the forms as eternal ideas in the mind of God. Thomas Aquinas was an Aristotelian, grounding theology in logic and natural philosophy. Between them, Plato and Aristotle shaped not just philosophy but science, politics, theology, and art. As the debates raged and students came and went, Plato himself was entering the final chapter of a life consumed by questions. But there remained a mystery about what he truly believed in his deepest hours. There is a puzzle at the heart of Plato's legacy. According to Aristotle, who knew him for 2 decades, Plato taught certain doctrines orally that he never committed to writing. These were reserved for the inner circle of advanced students, shared in lectures and private conversations, but deliberately excluded from the dialogues. Aristotle refers to these as Plato's unwritten doctrines, and he treats them as central to understanding what Plato actually believed, as opposed to what the dialogues with their dramatic indirection and inconclusiveness seem to suggest. One of these lectures became infamous. Plato delivered a public talk titled On the Good. People came expecting a discussion of ethics, practical wisdom, how to live well. Instead, Plato gave them mathematical metaphysics. He spoke of the one and the indefinite dyad, of numbers as the foundation of reality, of the good as a principle beyond being. The audience was baffled, most left disappointed or confused. What was Plato teaching? According to Aristotle's account, Plato's ultimate principles were 2. The one representing absolute unity, the source of all determinacy and form, and the indefinite dyad representing multiplicity, otherness, the principle of division and difference. All reality, including the forms themselves, was generated from the interaction of these 2 principles. The forms were not the highest realities, but derived from something even more fundamental, numbers, which in turn derive from the one and the dyad. This was Pythagoreanism taken to its extreme, a vision of the universe as fundamentally mathematical, with philosophy ascending beyond even the forms to pure, numerical and metaphysical principles. But if this was Plato's deepest teaching, why did he not write it down? Part of the answer may lie in the seventh letter, a text attributed to Plato, though its authenticity is debated. In it, Plato reflects on the nature of knowledge and writing. He argues that the highest truths cannot be conveyed through written words. Writing is static, unable to respond to questions or adapt to the listener's understanding. Truth. Real philosophical understanding comes only through sustained engagement, through living the philosophical life, through dialectical conversation that kindles insight like fire leaping from one mind to another. The dialogues then were not meant to contain Plato's final doctrines. They were propeutic preparatory exercises designed to train the mind and awaken the desire for wisdom. The inner teaching was reserved for those who had proven themselves ready, transmitted orally in the Academy's private sessions. Later Neoplatonists, especially Plotinus in the 3rd century AD, claimed to be preserving these unwritten teachings, building their elaborate metaphysical systems on the foundation of the one and the dyad. Modern scholars debate how much of this is genuinely Platonic, and how much reflects the views of Speusippus and other successors who may have developed Plato's hints in directions he never intended. The enigma remains: did Plato, the greatest writer of philosophical prose in Western history, believe that his deepest thoughts could never be written? And if so, are those thoughts lost forever? Or do they whisper between the lines of the dialogues for those patient enough to listen? Whether in written dialogues or whispered teachings, Plato's work continued as his body began its inevitable decline, and the philosopher who'd spent his life contemplating the immortal soul prepared to test that belief himself. By the 350s BC, Plato was in his 70s. The Academy had been operating for more than 30 years, an institution firmly established, drawing students from across the Mediterranean. The sacred grove where he walked each morning was familiar. The routines of teaching and study well worn, comforting in their predictability. His days followed a pattern: morning walks through the garden paths, sometimes alone, sometimes with a favoured student. Lectures in the afternoon where he would sit and pose questions, guiding the dialectical exchange. Evening spent writing, the stylus moving slowly across wax tablets, crafting the sentences that would become the laws, his longest and final dialogue. The physical decline was undeniable. His hearing had weakened. His eyesight, once sharp enough to read the stars, now struggled with close text. His energy flagged. The body, that prison of the soul he'd written about for decades, was proving its mortality. But his mind remained clear, still restless, still probing. The Academy's reputation had grown to become the supreme intellectual institution in the Greek world. Students came from Syracuse, from Macedon, from the cities of Asia Minor, seeking the education that could be found nowhere else. Some stayed for years, others visited briefly, carrying back to their cities the methods and ideas they had learned. Plato's influence was spreading, not through conquest or political power, but through the quiet work of teaching. Visitors arrived regularly. Former students returned to report on their lives, to seek advice, to reconnect with the community that had shaped them. Some had become rulers, applying philosophical principles to governance. Others were teachers themselves, establishing schools in imitation of the Academy. Plato received them with courtesy, listened to their stories, offered what wisdom he could. There was quiet satisfaction in this. The school would outlast him. The work would continue. The pursuit of truth was no longer dependent on a single individual, but was embedded in an institution, a tradition, a living community. But there were shadows too. Socrates had been dead for 50 years, yet Plato still carried the grief, the unanswered question of how the wisest man could be killed by his own city. The failures in Syracuse, the death of Dion, the whole catastrophic attempt to merge philosophy and politics, those wounds had not healed. In the Laws, his final major work, the pessimism is palpable. The ideal city of the Republic had given way to a realistic compromise, a city for flawed human beings who would never be philosophers. The sense had settled in, confirmed by bitter experience, that philosophy and politics were incompatible, at least in the world as it existed. Truth was pursued in gardens and schools, not in assemblies and palaces. His dialogues were being copied, circulated, read beyond Athens. They were becoming canonical, the foundation of a philosophical tradition. Students debated them, memorized passages, argued over their meanings. Plato was no longer just a teacher. He was becoming an authority, a classic. His relationship with his students had shifted. No longer the vigorous questioner, he was now grandfatherly, a figure of wisdom and experience. They revered him, protected him, managed the academy's affairs so he could focus on writing. He was aware of mortality. The soul's immortality was not just a theory, but a lived belief, a conviction that shaped how he faced the coming end. Death was not oblivion, but transformation, a return to the realm of forms, a release from the body's prison. In the year 348 or 347 BC, after 8 decades of life and 6 decades of philosophy, Plato's journey approached its end, and the manner of his death would stand in stark contrast to the tragedy that had defined his youth. The exact year is uncertain, 348 or 347 BC, depending on which ancient chronology you follow. Plato was 80 or 81 years old, an extraordinary age for the ancient world, a lifespan that had stretched across nearly a century of Greek history. The accounts of his death are varied, and like much about the great philosopher wrapped in legend. One tradition claims he died at a wedding feast surrounded by music and celebration, a fitting end for the author of the Symposium. Another, more widely accepted, says he died peacefully in his sleep in his own bed in the quiet hours of the night. There are no recorded final words, unlike Socrates, who spent his last day in philosophical conversation and left the strange enigmatic instruction about the rooster ode to Asclepius. Plato seems to have simply slipped away. No trial, no poison, no injustice, just the natural conclusion of a long and fully lived life. Some sources say he was found in the morning with a stylus still nearby, suggesting he'd been working even in his final hours, perhaps on the Laws, which some believe he left unfinished. The image is poignant. The philosopher at work until the very end, the examined life pursued to the last breath. His body was prepared for burial according to Athenian custom. The academy community, his students and colleagues grieved. They had lost not just a teacher, but the centre of their intellectual world, the man who had founded the school and defined its mission. Funeral rites were performed, eulogies delivered by those who had known him best. The question of where he was buried has 2 answers in the ancient sources. Some say he was laid to rest in the academy grounds themselves, the sacred grove that had been his life's work, allowing him to remain in spirit where he had spent his final decades. Others claim he was buried in the Ceramicus, the great cemetery of Athens, where the city honoured its most distinguished citizens. Either way, the grave marker was likely simple. In keeping with the philosophical life's rejection of ostentation, Spucus, Plato's nephew, was chosen to succeed him as scholar, head of the academy. It was not an obvious choice. Speusippus was a competent philosopher, but not a towering intellect. The fact that Aristotle, by far the most brilliant student Plato had ever taught, was passed over, speaks to the complexities of succession, the politics within the school, and perhaps Aristotle's growing divergence from Platonic orthodoxy. Aristotle left Athens shortly after Plato's death, eventually settling in Assos before later returning to found his own school, the Lyceum. The Academy and the Lyceum would become rival institutions representing the two great streams of Greek philosophy. The immediate students who remained at the Academy eulogized Plato, celebrating his contributions. Athens itself recognized the loss. Here was a citizen who had brought honor to the city not through military conquest or political power, but through wisdom, through the relentless pursuit of truth, through the creation of an institution that would educate generations. Plato's death was not the dramatic martyrdom of his teacher. There was no crowd, no vote, no hemlock. It was a philosopher's death in the truest sense. Having lived fully, having thought deeply, having examined every corner of existence, from politics to cosmology, from love to mathematics, from the soul's immortality to the structure of the ideal state. Socrates had lived the unexamined life is not worth living. Plato had lived the examined life to its fullest expression. And now, according to his own teaching, his soul was free, released from the body's prison, ascending to the realm of forms he'd spent a lifetime trying to describe. But death was not the end of Plato's influence. It was barely the beginning, and the ideas he left behind would shape human thought in ways he could never have imagined. When Plato died, the Academy did not. Speusippus, his nephew, took control as Skol, the head of the school, and under his leadership the institution continued. He led from 347 to 339 BC, 8 years during which he emphasized the mathematical and mystical dimensions of Plato's thought, particularly the doctrine of the one and the indefinite dyad that Plato had taught orally but never written down. After Speusippus came Xenocrates, who led from 339 to 314 BC, a steady and systematic thinker who worked to preserve what he understood as Platonic orthodoxy. Then came Polyon, and after him Crates. This period the old Academy remained faithful to the spirit of the founder, continuing to teach the immortality of the soul, the reality of the forms, and the centrality of mathematics and dialectic. But in the 3rd century BC, something unexpected happened. The Academy took a skeptical turn. Around 266 BC, Eros became scholic and transformed the school's teaching. He argued that Socrates' true legacy was not the theory of forms, but his confession of ignorance. Socrates had said he knew nothing. Eros radicalized this into a philosophical position. True knowledge is impossible. We can never be certain of anything. The best we can do is suspend judgment and examine all sides of every question. The Academy became a school of skepticism, dedicated to dismantling dogmatic claims, rather than defending any positive doctrine. This Middle Academy phase continued under Carneades in the 2nd century BC. He refined the skeptical position into probabilism, arguing that while certainty is impossible, we can judge some beliefs as more likely than others and act on degrees of probability. The dogmatic certainty of the forms was abandoned. It was a strange fate for Plato's school, but perhaps not entirely unfaithful. After all, many of Plato's dialogues end in aporia, in puzzlement with no final answers. Perhaps the skeptics were emphasizing one strand of the Platonic inheritance. In the 1st century BC, the Academy shifted again. Antiochus of Ascalon led a return to what he called the true Plato, rejecting the skeptical detour and reviving interest in the classic doctrines. This phase, sometimes called Middle Platonism, blended Plato with elements of Stoicism and Aristotle, creating a synthetic philosophy that would influence the Roman world. Cicero, the great Roman orator and statesman, studied at the academy under Antiochus and brought Platonic ideas to Rome, translating Greek philosophical vocabulary into Latin and making Plato accessible to a new culture. Meanwhile, outside the academy, a new interpretation of Plato was emerging. Neoplatonism, developed by Plotinus and his successors in the 3rd century AD, would become the dominant form of Platonic thought in late antiquity. But the academy itself continued in Athens as a centre of philosophical education, teaching generations of students who carried its methods across the Mediterranean for 916 years. The academy operated continuously. It was the longest-running institution of higher learning in human history, surpassing any modern university by centuries. Students walked the same garden path where Plato had walked. They debated under the same trees. The tradition lived. In 529 AD, the Christian Roman Emperor Justinian, determined to suppress paganism, issued a decree closing the academy and forbidding the teaching of philosophy by non-Christians. The grove fell silent. The world's first university, founded in 387 BC, was finally shut down, its endowment confiscated, its teachers scattered. But while the physical academy eventually fell, Plato's ideas began a second life, transformed and elevated by new interpreters who would turn his philosophy into something closer to mystical religion. In the 3rd century AD, as the Roman Empire staggered through crisis and the old certainties collapsed, a philosopher named Plotinus reimagined Plato's vision with a mystical intensity that would reshape Western thought. Plotinus was born around 204 AD, likely in Egypt. He studied in Alexandria, the great cosmopolitan centre of learning, and spent years searching for wisdom, even joining a military expedition to Persia, hoping to learn from Eastern sages. Eventually he settled in Rome, where he taught and gathered a devoted circle of students. His lectures were collected by his student Phery into a work called the Enneads, 54 treatises organized into 6 groups of 9. At the heart of Plotinus's system was the One, the absolute source of all reality, beyond being itself, beyond thought, beyond description. The One is not a thing among things or even a god in the traditional sense. It is utterly transcendent, ineffable, the pure principle of unity from which everything else flows. From the One emanates the intellect, the realm of the forms, the divine mind that contains all eternal truths and archetypes. From the intellect emanates the soul, which gives life and motion to the physical world. And at the furthest remove from the One is matter, the realm of multiplicity, change and imperfection. Reality is a descending hierarchy, each level a dimmer reflection of the brilliant source. The human soul, Plotinus taught, belongs by nature to the higher realms, but has descended into matter into the body. The entire purpose of philosophy is the soul's return journey, climbing back up the ladder of emanation through purification, virtue, and contemplative practice. At the summit of this ascent lies the possibility of mystical union, what Plotinus called the flight of the alone to the alone. In rare moments of profound contemplation, the soul can transcend even the intellect and merge briefly with the One itself, experiencing an ecstatic unity beyond words. Plotinus himself claimed to have achieved this union 4 times in his life. Phery, his devoted student, edited the Enneads after Plotinus's death, and wrote a life of Plotinus that reads almost like the biography of a saint. describing his master's aesthetic discipline, his otherworldly detachment, and his spiritual power. The Neoplatonic tradition continued through Iamachus, who added thy ritual practices meant to invoke divine assistance. Philosophy alone was not enough. The soul needed the gods to reach upward and pull it toward the divine. Then came Proclus in the 5th century, who systematized the entire vision with scholastic precision in his Elements of Theology, a work of breathtaking logical rigor applied to mystical metaphysics. Neoplatonism's influence on Christianity was immense. Augustine, the greatest of the Latin Church Fathers, encountered Neoplatonic texts in Milan before his conversion. The vision of an immaterial, eternal realm of truth, of the soul's fallen condition and need for ascent, of the good as the source of all being. These prepared him to accept Christian doctrine. The Christian Trinity could be understood through the Neoplatonic triad of one, intellect, and soul. Pseudo-Dionysius, a Christian writer of the 5th or 6th century, baptized Neoplatonism wholesale, creating a Christian mystical theology that would dominate medieval thought. The last pagan Neoplatonists teaching in Athens and Alexandria as the Christian empire closed in around them saw themselves as heroic defenders of ancient wisdom against a new dark age. When Justinian closed the academy in 529, they fled east to Persia, carrying their books and their tradition into exile. But in a deeper sense, they had already won. Neoplatonism had been absorbed into Christianity, and through Christianity Plato's ideas would dominate the medieval world. Christianity would carry Plato's ideas into the medieval world. But in forms the old philosopher might not recognize, as the forms became thoughts in the mind of God and Athens married Jerusalem. The early Christians were suspicious of Greek philosophy. Paul had warned against being deceived by philosophy and empty deceit. The pagan schools taught doctrines incompatible with revelation, the eternity of the world, the transmigration of souls, the divinity of the stars. And yet from the beginning Christianity could not escape Platonic language. The Gospel of John opens with a phrase that resonates unmistakably with Greek philosophy. In the beginning was the Logos. The word logos was a term dense with philosophical meaning used by Stoics and Platonists to describe the rational principle that orders the cosmos. John was translating the Christian message into the conceptual vocabulary of the Hellenistic world. Justin Martyr, a Christian apologist of the 2nd century, had studied Platonic philosophy before his conversion. He argued that Plato had seen Christian truth dimly like shadows on the cave wall. Philosophy was a preparation, a schoolmaster leading the Greeks toward the full revelation that came with Christ. Whatever was true in Plato was compatible with Christianity, because all truth comes from the same divine source. Clement of Alexandria pushed further. Philosophy was God's gift to the Greeks. Just as the law was God's gift to the Jews, both prepared the way for the gospel. Origen, the brilliant and controversial theologian of the 3rd century, incorporated Platonic cosmology wholesale. He taught the pre-existence of souls, the idea that all rational beings existed before their embodiment and fell into matter through some primordial choice. The Church would later condemn this as heretical, but it shows how deeply Platonism had penetrated Christian thought. The pivot came with Augustine of Hippo in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Augustine's Confessions tells the story of his conversion, and Platonism plays a central role. Struggling with materialism, unable to conceive of anything immaterial, Augustine encountered the books of the Platonists, translations of Plotinus and Fairy. Reading them, he experienced a vision of eternal immaterial truth, a realm beyond the physical senses. It shattered his materialist assumptions and prepared him intellectually and spiritually to accept Christianity. Later, Augustine reflected that Platonism showed him what to seek: the eternal, the good, the immaterial God. Christianity showed him how to reach it through grace, through Christ, through the Church. In Augustine's mature theology, the forms become the eternal ideas in the mind of God. They're not a separate realm, but the thoughts of the Creator, the archetypes according to which all things are made. The soul's journey is not a mystical ascent, but a return to God through faith and love, time and eternity, earth and heaven, the city of man and the city of God. All these distinctions carry Platonic structure. For 1,000 years, medieval scholasticism would be dominated by Christian Platonism. Only in the 13th century, when Aristotle's works were rediscovered and translated from Arabic, would Thomas Aquinas attempt a grand synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. Dante Alighieri, writing the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, places in limbo the first circle of hell. It is the highest honour a pagan can receive. No punishment, only the sorrow of being separated from God. Plato dwells there with Homer, Aristotle, and the other virtuous pagans who lived before Christ. Noble souls denied salvation only by the accident of their birth. It is a recognition of the debt. Christianity had become unthinkable without Plato. The forms, the immortal soul, the ascent from material to spiritual, the vision of the good. These were now woven into the fabric of Christian metaphysics and mysticism. But the Renaissance would rediscover a Plato less tamed by Christianity, more radical and inspiring, and in that rediscovery, modernity would begin. For 1,000 years, Western Europe knew Plato mostly through fragments and second-hand accounts. Augustine had read him. Boethius had translated a few works. The Tebus was available in a partial Latin translation, but the dialogues as a whole, the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo, the Laws, these were lost to the Latin West, preserved only in Greek manuscripts locked away in the libraries of Byzantium. Then, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. The great city that had been the eastern Bulwark of Christendom for over 1,000 years was conquered. As the Ottomans swept through the streets, Greek scholars fled west, carrying with them the most precious cargo imaginable: manuscripts. Ancient texts that had not been seen in Italy for centuries suddenly appeared in Florence, Rome, and Venice, and among them was the complete corpus of Plato. Cosimo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence, was fascinated. He was a banker and a politician, but also a patron of learning, committed to the revival of ancient wisdom. He acquired a Greek manuscript of Plato's complete works and commissioned a young scholar named Marsilio Ficino to translate it into Latin. Ficino devoted his life to the task. In 1484, he published the first complete Latin translation of Plato ever produced in the West. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, Europeans could read the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo in their entirety. Cosimo also funded Ficino to establish a Platonic academy in Florence. Not a formal school like Plato's original, but a circle of humanists, poets, artists, and thinkers who gathered to discuss philosophy, beauty, and the soul. It became the intellectual heart of the Renaissance. One member of this circle was Piccadella Mirandola, who wrote the oration on the dignity of man, a text that became a manifesto of Renaissance humanism. Drawing on Plato, Pico argued that human beings occupy a unique position in the cosmos between beasts and angels. Unlike other creatures, humans are not fixed by nature. They can choose to descend into animal appetites or ascend toward divine contemplation, the soul's freedom and capacity for self-transformation. This was Plonic doctrine reborn, artists embraced the theory of forms with revolutionary enthusiasm. The sculptor's task, they now understood, was not to invent, but to reveal. The ideal form already existed, eternal and perfect. Michelangelo famously said that the sculpture was already complete within the marble. He merely removed the excess stone to free it. This was Platonism applied to art. The physical statue as an imperfect copy of the perfect form the artist had glimpsed through reason and imagination. Leonardo da Vinci filled his notebooks with studies of mathematical proportions, seeking the ideal ratios that govern beauty in the human face and body. Architecture embraced Platonic geometry. Andrea Palladio designed villas based on perfect mathematical relationships. Buildings meant to embody harmony and proportion, reflections of the eternal forms. In literature, the concept of Platonic love became central to courtly poetry. Petrarch, Dante, and later Spenser celebrated love as a spiritual force that elevates the soul toward the divine, not mere physical desire, but Eros transformed into a ladder of ascent toward beauty itself. Political thinkers revived the dream of the ideal city. Thomas More's Utopia imagined a perfect island society governed by reason. Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun described a philosophical republic organized according to wisdom and virtue. Both were self-conscious descendants of Plato's Republic. The Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning, was in large measure a rebirth of Plato. Humanism, art, architecture, poetry, political theory, all were steeped in the recovered dialogues. The birth of modernity was inseparable from the return of an ancient philosopher who had died 2,000 years earlier, but whose ideas proved immortal. From the Renaissance forward, Plato's influence would weave through every domain of Western thought, sometimes visible, often hidden, shaping even those who believed they had moved beyond him. The 17th and 18th centuries were defined by a great philosophical divide, rationalism versus empiricism, and that divide was in a profound sense an argument over Plato. The rationalists Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz were Platonic in spirit. They believed that the deepest truths are discovered through reason, not the senses. Mathematical truths are known innately, not learned from experience. The soul is immaterial and immortal. Reality has a rational structure accessible to the mind. These are Platonic themes. Even when the vocabulary has changed, the empiricist Loach Hume rejected all of this. There are no innate ideas. The mind at birth is a blank slate. Knowledge comes from sensory experience alone. Abstract entities like Platonic forms are fictions. This was an Aristotelian revolt against Plato, a grounding of philosophy in the observable material world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, one of the founding texts of modern political philosophy, is explicitly Platonic. Rousseau imagines constructing the ideal state through reason, asking what form of government would be truly just. His concept of the general will, the rational collective good that should guide the state, echoes the tripartite structure of Plato's Republic, where reason must rule over spirit and appetite. Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy has a fundamentally Platonic architecture. Kant distinguishes between noumena, things as they are in themselves, and phenomena, things as they appear to us. We can never know the noumena directly, only the phenomena filtered through our senses and mental categories. This is strikingly similar to Plato's distinction between the forms and the physical world. The eternal realities exist, but we cannot grasp them directly in this life. Hegel's dialectical method, the engine of his entire philosophical system, derives from Platonic dialogue. Thesis confronts antithesis. Contradiction is resolved in synthesis and thought moves forward. Hegel saw his absolute idea as the culmination of this process, the fully realized rational structure of reality, a concept deeply resonant with Plato's form of the good. The Romantics' Wordsworth cage shell embrace Platonic transcendence. Wordsworth's ode, Intimations of Immortality, describes the soul as coming from afar, trailing clouds of glory from a heavenly origin, precisely the Platonic doctrine of recollection and pre-existence. The 19th century brought fierce challenges. Darwin's theory of evolution suggested that species are not fixed eternal forms, but mutable products of natural selection. Marx turned Plato on his head, arguing that material conditions determine ideas, not the other way around. Nature attacked Plato as the great villain of Western philosophy, the architect of a true world that devalues this world, a life-denying metaphysics that poisons human vitality. Yet even these critiques prove Plato's centrality. You cannot reject what is not influential. In the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead delivered the famous verdict: the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Whether in process philosophy, analytic philosophy, or phenomenology, Plato remains the interlocutor. Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies critiqued the Republic as a proto-totalitarian blueprint, a closed society hostile to freedom and change. The debate over whether Plato is an enemy or a friend of liberal democracy continues in political philosophy seminars to this day. Plato has become inescapable. His questions, what is justice? What is real? How should we live remain the foundational questions of philosophy. His theory of form still structures debates in the philosophy of mathematics. His ideal city haunts every utopian project. His ascent of love shapes how we talk about spirituality and desire. Beyond academic philosophy, Plato's presence saturates the culture we inhabit, often invisibly in ways we rarely notice, but can never fully escape. Plato's influence is not confined to philosophy departments or medieval theology. It saturates the modern world in ways we rarely notice, hidden in our language, our assumptions, and the very structure of our thinking. Consider mathematics. When a mathematician discovers a new theorem, are they inventing it or discovering it? Most mathematicians, if pressed, will say discovering. The theorem was always true even before any human knew it. The Pythagorean theorem held before Pythagoras, before humans, before the earth existed. This is Platonism, the belief that mathematical objects exist independently of human minds in an eternal realm we access through reason. Roger Penrose, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, is an explicit Platonist. He argues that mathematical truths inhabit a timeless reality, that mathematicians explore the way astronomers explore the stars. Kurt Gödel, who proved that any sufficiently complex mathematical system contains true statements that cannot be proven within that system, was also a Platonist. He believed he was discovering facts about an objective mathematical realm. The opposing view, nominalism, says numbers are just useful fictions, names we give to patterns. But most working mathematicians find this psychologically unconvincing. It feels like discovery, not invention. In physics, the question becomes even more striking. Why is the universe mathematical? Why do equations describe the behavior of galaxies, atoms, and everything in between with such precision? Einstein called this the eternal mystery of the world. It is a Platonic mystery. Max Tegmark, a cosmologist, has proposed the radical hypothesis that the universe is not just described by mathematics. It is mathematics. Physical reality is a mathematical structure, This is Plato taken to the extreme. In computer science and virtual reality, the cave allegory has found a literal embodiment. We now create simulated worlds, digital environments indistinguishable from reality to those inside them. Philosopher Nick Bostonram has argued that if civilizations can create realistic simulations, and if they create many of them, then statistically we're more likely to be living in a simulation than in base reality. The shadows on the cave wall have become pixels on a screen. The question, what is real, is no longer abstract. In psychology, Sigmund Freud's model of the mind, id, ego and superego, maps almost perfectly onto Plato's tripartite soul. The id is appetite, the drive for pleasure and gratification. The superego is spirit, the internalized voice of morality and social norms. The ego is reason, mediating between the two. This is not coincidence. Freud was classically educated and steeped in Plato. The structure of the psyche he discovered through clinical work was shaped by the philosophical framework he had inherited. In political theory, every debate about technocracy versus democracy is a debate about the philosopher-king. Should societies be governed by experts, scientists, economists, philosophers, or by the people? Meritocracy, rule by the most qualified, is the modern term for what Plato proposed. The criticisms are also Platonic in origin. Who decides who is qualified? Who guards the guardians? The liberal arts model of education still defended in universities is Platonic. The trivium and quadrivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were meant to free the mind from the cave of ignorance to train reason before moving to specialized knowledge. Education is liberation, not job training. In popular culture, Plato is everywhere. The Matrix trilogy is an explicit retelling of the cave allegory. Neo is the prisoner freed to see reality, then burdened with the mission to return and free others. The Truman Show, Inception, Dark City, all explore Platonic questions about the nature of reality and illusion. Even our language betrays the influence. When we speak of a Platonic ideal, we mean the perfect version of something, the standard against which imperfect instances are measured. We're invoking the theory of forms without realizing it. Plato is not a historical curiosity. He is part of the operating system of Western thought running quietly in the background of our minds. In our final moments together, we return to where we began. A young man in an Athenian courtroom watching his teacher die, and the question that haunted him for 80 years. We began with Socrates' trial in 399 BC, with a young aristocrat named Plato watching the wisest man in Athens condemned to death by a democratic jury for the crime of asking questions. That moment shattered Plato's world and gave birth to the question that would consume the next 50 years of his life. What is justice? After 8 decades of living and 6 decades of philosophy, what was Plato's answer? It was complex, it evolved. The Republic's ideal city, with its philosopher-kings and communal child-rearing and censorship of poetry, can be read as a sincere blueprint for a just society, or as a warning about what perfection would actually require. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps Plato was showing us what justice demands and forcing us to confront whether we're willing to pay the cost. The question remains alive. Is justice giving each person what they deserve as Plato suggested? Or is it equality, fairness, liberty? Every political philosophy since has been an attempt to answer or refine or reject Plato's framing, but none has escaped it. What is real? Plato argued for the existence of an eternal immaterial realm of forms more real than the physical world we perceive. Are we discovering truth or constructing it? Science discovers mathematical laws that seem to exist independently of us. Plato vindicated. But neuroscience suggests that categories like beauty and justice are patterns our brains create. Aristotle's critique confirmed. The question is unresolved, perhaps unresolvable, but it is still Plato's question. What is the good life? Plato's answer was contemplation of truth, the harmony of the soul achieved through reason ruling over spirit and appetite, the philosopher's ascent from the cave to the sunlight. The modern world offers different answers: pleasure, success, authenticity, connection, freedom. But the question itself, the demand that we justify how we live rather than simply drift through existence, that is Socratic and Platonic. The unexamined life is not worth living. We may reject Plato's answer, but we cannot escape his question. Can politics ever be just? Every attempt to create a philosopher-king has failed. Syracuse ended in assassination. The French Revolution's reign of virtue became the reign of terror. 20th century utopian experiments produced tyranny, and yet we cannot stop trying to improve our systems. To imagine better forms of government, to ask whether rule by the people or rule by the wise is the path to justice. The attempt and the failure are both part of Plato's legacy. Plato's true achievement is not in the answers he gave, but in the questions he taught us to ask. The dialogues often end in aporia, in puzzlement, with Socrates and his interlocutors no closer to a definition than when they started. This was deliberate. Philosophy is not about delivering doctrine. It is about awakening the desire to know, about training the mind to question its own assumptions. Education, Plato said, is not filling a vessel, but kindling a flame. 2,400 years after his death, we read Plato and recognize ourselves. The same confusions about justice, the same longing for something eternal in a world of flux, the same wonder at the mystery of existence. The dialogues feel contemporary because the questions are permanent. The boy who watched his teacher die for asking questions spent his entire life ensuring that those questions would never die. Every philosophy department where students debate the nature of reality, every ethical argument about what is right, every utopian political theory sketched on paper, every person who stops and asks, but what is justice really? In all of these, Plato is present. The academy was closed by imperial decree in 529 AD, but its true closing never came. Every classroom where the Socratic method is practiced, every seminar where assumptions are challenged and definitions demanded, every mind that refuses easy answers, these are the academy. It never closed. It simply spread. Plato did not give us a system to memorize. He gave us a way of thinking, a restlessness, a refusal to accept the shadows on the wall as the whole of reality. He gave us philosophy itself. If this journey through Plato's world has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know in the comments what question of Plato's resonates most with you today. What part of his thought still challenges or inspires you? Thank you for joining me in the long shadow of Plato, a shadow that stretches across 2.5 millennia and still shapes the world we inhabit. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful